And in other ones, there's very little. But even in human beings, up till about the age of 4, we have some regenerative capacity in our fingertips. And so the work you did in frogs, it ties into this idea that, okay, if regenerative capacity goes down across developmental time, perhaps there are ways we can reawaken it even in the adult animal.
Exactly, exactly. And brings us some sort of evolutionary questions as well. It's like, why did we lose them?
Yeah.
What was the cost? Was there an energetic metabolic cost to losing them so that we can gain it elsewhere? So these are some interesting questions in regenerative medicine that
Mhm.
should be asked and
Mhm.
answered.
And how did you reawaken this regenerative potential in the Xenopus frog? You said you added a few compounds. Were these small molecules? Were these transcription factors? What was the biology there?
Mhm. So our main goal was to, and much like with many of my research projects, is to not micromanage from bottom up, so not from genetics up, but to from systems down kind of control. So we had to solve this in two problems. One, can we create an environment that will even allow for regeneration? And then two, what are we putting into that system to kickstart those pathways? So the first dimension of microenvironment is using silk hydrogel. There's a reason why we picked silk hydrogels because on the physics side, we see that if you increase stiffness and you change the stiffness components interacting with wound healing, it'll induce fibrosis or scarring. So the mechanical landscape is very important. And so that's why we use silk hydrogel. So the water is also very important in wound healing. In terms of the chemical compounds, we picked five very specific compounds, hormones and proteins that target very specific pathways in wound healing that prevent scar formation and induce, like for example, we had brain-derived neurotrophic factor (BDNF), well-known compound associated with neural plasticity, neural growth, growth hormone, for example, that targets the metabolism and bone formation. So there's each of those compounds were selected based on their individual capabilities. And using our device that was silk based, we delivered it to the wound site after a full limb amputation in frogs. We applied it for only 24 hours, removed the device, and let the animal take over from there.
Mhm. So it sounds like there's a biochemical component to this. You introduce certain factors that are like growth factors that are thought to or known to induce, the building up of tissue, but there's also a purely physical component to this. The actual physical material that you used was important for how the regrowth happened and whether or not you had more or less scarring.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Wow.
And this is now becoming a well-known domain on the physics side, is that the mechanosensitivity or mechanotransduction, there's a interplay between the stiffness, the mechanics of things, and how information gets transduced to the chemical landscape. And there are, for example, piezo channels, mechanotransductive ion channels, for example, that we know that are on the skin, but we're now starting to see that they're also within tissues as well,
Hmm.
within deep tissues.
Hmm. And then I think earlier you also mentioned that wound healing is affected by light as well. What do we know there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, going back into the photobiomodulation community, near infrared and red light is now well established for anti-inflammatory properties and for accelerating wound healing. Red light has also been implicated in angiogenesis, so increasing more vasculature to promote wound healing. So if you have more vasculature, you have more nutrients getting to the site to help heal and close the wounds. Again, how is the missing dimension?
Mhm.
What is it about putting light into what is, I guess if we rephrase, what is it about putting energy into the system that allows biology to interact with it
Yeah,
to
yeah.
change the chemical landscape?
Yes, we know that wavelengths of light in the on the red side can affect these things, but we don't know exactly how that's happening. But at some level, it must probably be, the mitochondria are sensitive to those wavelengths. Obviously, they're involved very intimately in what the cell is doing from a metabolic perspective and an
Mm,
energy use perspective. So probably there's some kind of mitochondrial modulation happening that is influencing how these like anabolic processes actually play out.
absolutely. I mean, even to this point, we know that cytochrome C oxidase and complex 4, these important proteins within the mitochondria, have wavelength specificities. They seem to be red leaning. So it could make sense that that's why red light seems to be working for mitochondrial function. But there's a new perspective that I've been working with Martin Picard out of Columbia with, trying to understand the energetic resistance, so that
Hmm.
certain systems are at certain thresholds of energy levels. And based on their molecular landscape, perhaps we can alter these resistance levels to incoming energy inputs, for example, light, magnetic fields. Um, Again, theories that need to be validated, but it kind of helps understand from a first principles point of view. You asked the question, energy, what does that mean? How is it getting manipulated in these systems? And what does light have to do with it,
Mhm.
as a form of energy?
Yeah. So in the context of regeneration and wound healing, which, I suppose these are just, points along a spectrum. Regeneration is just sort of a very impressive form of wound healing, it seems. But, we have some capacity to restore our tissues when we're injured. And you've told us now that physical aspects of the environment, like light and light, just the tension and the rigidity of the mechanical stuff that our bodies interact with, affects how these regenerative or healing processes happen. One area this immediately makes me think about is, wow, every time we get a cut or a broken bone or a scrape, we're covering it with band-aids and casts and things that have certain mechanical properties, things that have certain light blocking properties. What do you
Mhm.
think about when it comes to the sort of the traditional things that we use in modern society to cover up or try and restore our broken bodies? Is there something here that might be that might tie in? Is there something we might be upsetting by, say, blocking light from getting to a broken bone or to a cut or something like that?
That's a good question. I'm not sure we're kind of inhibiting anything. I think evolutionarily we've kind of evolved to kind of be the best versions of these processes as possible, but I think we can make them better, which we are.
Mhm.
Post-surgical light stimulation is now being utilized, especially within the red spectrum,
Hmm.
to accelerate wound healing. Even starting to understand that at post-surgical scars, to keep them hydrated. The fact that water is extremely important. Water loss inhibits wound healing. Again, that kind of brings us to this logic. You have an injury, you lose water. We know that water is also able to interact with red wavelengths of light. So, is it the fact that we keep water in our body to help absorb light?
Hmm.
So, there's these logic gaps that we're starting to try to fill in to see how the physical dimension has been interacting with the molecular. And another important point that I want to point out, since we're talking about wound healing and light, whenever you have an injury, you do have reactive oxygen species that are
Mhm.
getting emitted, which is what we are saying is the source of our light. That reactive oxygen species is crucial to recruiting your immune system to that wound site.
Yeah.
So it's basically a light beacon, that a
Hmm.
light emitting beacon that's recruiting these immune cells to help form a scar so you don't bleed out or have an infection. So there is an intrinsic that we now know is a light communication mechanism in the form of reactive oxygen species to recruit immune cells. So there's already a dimension that we understand.
Mhm.
Now we need to kind of probe further into how and why.
Yeah. I'm sorry. So are you saying it's actually been demonstrated that one of the ways the immune cells get recruited to a site of injury is they are following the light?
Perhaps, yeah. If we're saying that reactive oxygen species is a source of light, when you have one ROS being emitted, one photon gets emitted or some source, then yes, that is true.
Oh,
And we
but
see this also within in red light stimulation as well. So we probe red light into a wound site, you get a high recruitment of neutrophils and immune cells into that area.
okay, I see. So just the presence of light of the white right wavelength can help you recruit more immune cells to the site of injury.
Correct.
Hmm.
Correct.
Interesting. So this would imply that if I've got a cut or a scrape or something and I'm inside all day versus outside, like the light environment could play a role in how quickly or exactly how my wound heals.
Wound heals, correct? Absolutely. And again, this is such a fascinating and multi-dimensional conversation because there's many different levels to this, right? You
Mhm.
have the physical side of, compressing a wound, the fact that you hold a wound to accelerate it. You have the optical side with the lights, and then you have the chemical side of actually repairing the pattern tissue of what happens. Um, very exciting. Lots of work that needs to be done to really flesh this out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. To flesh it out. Yeah. um, I think you do some work in cancer as well, and there's the whole world that could be discussed here. But just give us a basic idea. Are you working on cancer at all? And why is someone like a biophysicist who's been talking about all of this stuff that we've discussed so far? What is interesting about cancer to you from a biophysical perspective?
I am actively working on cancer, and it's these model systems and these processes, so neuroscience, cancer, regenerative medicine, all of them are a platform for me to try to understand the physics of life.